Exploited by the Nashville elite since the age of 8, Hank Williams Jr. pounded liquor and drugs daily to escape a system that forced him into being a money-making machine. His rebellion drove him to an attempted suicide before a slip sent him into a 150-meter freefall that smashed his skull against a cliff face. Surviving with a portion of his brain exposed, he continued to spiral into a deep pit of self-destruction, fueled by a brutal addiction to painkillers. Randall Hank Williams was 3 years old when his father's heart stopped in the back of a powder blue Cadillac on January 1st, 1953. The death of Hank Williams Sr. instantly converted the toddler from a son into a corporate asset. Before the estate was fully settled, his mother, Audrey Williams, and the executives of the Nashville Music Syndicate recognized a massive, unexploited revenue stream. The public demanded the continuation of the Hank Williams brand. The industry needed a physical vessel to fulfill that demand. Randall became that vessel. They assigned him the stage name Bocephus, a moniker originally belonging to a crude wooden ventriloquist dummy. It was a literal description of his mandated function. By the time he was 8 years old, the conditioning was absolute. The management team initiated a strict regimen of identity erasure. They did not hire instructors to cultivate his individual musical talent. They hired former members of the Drifting Cowboys, his father's backing band, to drill him in precise mimicry. The boy was forced to study vinyl records for hours, analyzing and replicating his dead father's exact phrasing, the signature yodeling breaks, and the specific nasal intonation. He was stripped of normal childhood attire and forced into miniature heavy nudie cone rhinestone suits. In 1958, he was pushed onto a stage in Swainsboro, Georgia. He was instructed to stand under the spotlights, hold a disproportionately large guitar, and sing lovesick blues to a crowd of grieving adults. The audience wept and treated the child like a religious relic. For the executives at MGM Records and Acuff Rose Publications, the Georgia show proved the viability of their business model. The strategy of identity theft was highly profitable. Throughout his adolescence, Randall was locked into a grueling, highly monitored touring schedule across the American South. He played county fairs, high school auditoriums, and rough honky-tonks. The environment was volatile, saturated with alcohol and the grueling realities of 1960s road life. Yet he was kept in a rigid corporate cage. His set lists were mandated by contracts. He was strictly forbidden from altering the musical arrangements or injecting any personal flair into the performances. Night after night, he was required to project the deep despair, chronic loneliness, and adult betrayals embedded in his father's lyrics. Emotions he was ordered to parrot but lacked the life experience to understand. The exploitation peaked in 1964. MGM Studios produced Your Cheatin' Heart, a highly sanitized biographical film about Hank Sr. To maximize cross-promotional profits, the label demanded that a 15-year-old Hank Jr. provide the singing voice for the adult actor, George Hamilton. The recording sessions were heavily policed by Nashville producers, like Jim Vienno, whose sole objective was to ensure the product matched the established brand perfectly. Hank Jr. was handed the sheet music and ordered to deliver a flawless, ghostly imitation. The resulting soundtrack was a massive commercial success. It generated immense wealth for the labels and Audrey Williams, but it solidified the invisible trap around the teenager. He was earning capital for the syndicate, but he was entirely alienated from his own labor. Behind the closed doors of recording studios and tour buses, a fierce rebellion was taking root. Hank Jr. possessed a distinct musical ear, and his personal tastes aggressively rejected the sterile, highly produced Nashville sound that dominated the industry. He gravitated toward the raw, unvarnished output of bluesmen like Lightnin' Hopkins, the aggressive piano pounding of Jerry Lee Lewis, and the heavy electric instrumentation of emerging Southern rock bands. He wanted to plug in an electric guitar. He wanted a driving, heavy rhythm section. When he attempted to introduce original blues-driven material or heavier arrangements to the MGM executives, the retaliation was swift and severe. The Nashville establishment viewed his creative autonomy as a direct threat to their bottom line. Market research dictated that consumers bought his records to hear a replica. The label executives utilized their leverage, threatening to freeze his recording output, pull marketing budgets, and cancel his tours if he deviated from the formula. The ultimatum was clear: remain a profitable puppet or face financial and professional ruin. This sustained psychological compression broke him. By the late 1960s, Hank Jr. was a veteran of the music industry with a decade of road experience, yet he possessed zero control over his own life. The relentless requirement to suppress his actual identity, combined with the crushing expectations of the industry, triggered severe clinical depression. To manage the psychological toll and the physical exhaustion of the road, he began to self-medicate heavily. The descent was methodical and destructive. He was introduced to the standard touring cocktail of the era: amphetamines to stay awake for hundreds of miles of overnight driving, and heavy doses of alcohol to numb his nervous system before and after shows. He transitioned from beer to high-proof liquor, consuming massive quantities daily to dull the reality of his existence. As the 1970s began, his chemical dependency escalated into barbiturates and street drugs. His behavior became increasingly volatile. He missed scheduled appearances, alienated promoters, and deliberately sabotaged shows by showing up intoxicated and refusing to play the required hits. He was actively trying to destroy the brand the industry had built around him. The physical deterioration matched the psychological collapse. His vocal cords, strained by years of forced mimicry and burned by hard liquor, began to change. His weight fluctuated. He was isolated, deeply paranoid, and surrounded by enablers who were only concerned with keeping him functional enough to step on a stage and generate the nightly guarantee. In 1974, the situation reached a fatal threshold. At 25 years old, fully engulfed by addiction and suffocated by a career he despised, Hank Jr. made a calculated decision to end his life. Alone, he consumed a massive, lethal quantity of prescription painkillers and barbiturates. It was not a cry for help. It was a deliberate attempt to shut down the machinery permanently. The overdose resulted in a total systemic failure. He was discovered unresponsive and rushed to a hospital. Emergency medical personnel subjected him to brutal interventions, pumping his stomach and utilizing extreme measures to restart his respiratory system. He was revived on the absolute brink of death. He survived the overdose, but the event exposed the raw, ugly reality of the Nashville system. They had pushed a child into a mold until the man inside chose death over compliance. The stomach pump and activated charcoal in that 1974 emergency room offered no solution to the structural trap. Waking up at 25, heavily addicted to a rotating menu of uppers and downers, and still legally bound to the Nashville machinery, Hank Jr. realized that remaining within the city limits was a death sentence. To prevent a second successful attempt on his own life, he initiated a geographic and professional severing. He packed his gear, abandoned the epicenter of the country music establishment, and relocated to the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. He sought an environment that was geographically hostile to the music industry. Montana offered total isolation. There were no A&R executives, no sycophantic promoters, and no audiences demanding he play Your Cheatin' Heart. He embedded himself in the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountains, adopting a lifestyle of hunting, climbing, and heavy, isolated drinking. It was a desperate attempt to reset his nervous system and strip away the Bocephus persona that had been violently grafted onto him since childhood. But the isolation did not cure the depression, it merely relocated it. He traded the suffocating pressure of tour buses for the dangerous unpredictability of the wilderness. On the morning of August 8, 1975, this unpredictability materialized into a physical catastrophe. Accompanied by a friend, Dick Willie, and Willie's young son, Hank Jr. initiated a hike up Ajax Peak, a jagged, unforgiving summit straddling the border of Montana and Idaho. The elevation approaches 10,000 feet. The terrain is characterized by loose scree, steep granite drop-offs, and treacherous, unseasonal snowfields that persist through the late summer. The climbing party reached the upper elevations by mid-afternoon. To progress, they had to cross a steeply pitched, hardened snowpack. It was a routine traverse for experienced climbers, but the environmental conditions were highly unstable. As Hank Jr. stepped onto the snow, the surface beneath his boots gave way. He lost his footing, failing to self-arrest with his gear. Gravity took immediate control. He began to slide down the steep incline, rapidly accelerating as the snowfield angled sharply downward toward a severe drop-off. He slid for approximately 200 feet before the snow ended and the sheer cliff face began. He was launched directly into the open air. He plummeted vertically for an estimated 300 feet, free falling in a chaotic trajectory before violently impacting the jagged, exposed granite boulders at the base of the cliff. The physics of a fall from that altitude are consistently lethal. The human skeletal structure is not designed to withstand blunt force impact at terminal velocity. When he struck the rocks, his face and skull absorbed the primary shock wave. The resulting medical trauma was catastrophic and immediately life-threatening. His skull fractured in multiple places, splitting along the frontal and parietal bones. The impact entirely crushed his jaw, cheekbones, and nose, reducing his facial structure to a pulverized mass of bone fragments and torn tissue. The force was so extreme that it pushed his eyes out of their sockets, and the fracturing of his skull exposed a section of his brain to the freezing mountain air. He did not lose consciousness immediately. Historical accounts of the incident indicate that he lay on the blood-soaked rocks, fully aware of his shattered anatomy, while Dick Willie scrambled down the mountain to assess the damage. Willie found a scene of total biological destruction. Hank Jr. was bleeding profusely from his nose, mouth, and the massive fissures in his skull. Recognizing that his friend would bleed to death within hours, Willie left his young son with the dying man and began a grueling, desperate hike back down the mountain to find a forest ranger and initiate a rescue. For hours, Hank Jr. remained on the rocks. The temperature at that altitude dropped rapidly. He was bleeding out, suffering from extreme shock and fully exposed to the elements. The survival rate for exposed brain trauma in a remote high-altitude environment without immediate medical intervention is practically zero. Yet, his autonomic nervous system refused to shut down. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, navigating dangerous crosswinds to reach the remote crash site, the paramedics who loaded his broken body onto the stretcher operated under the assumption that they were transporting a corpse. He was airlifted to a hospital in Missoula, Montana. The initial triage assessment was bleak. The emergency room physicians were confronted with a patient whose facial architecture was non-existent. The immediate priority was not reconstruction, but simply maintaining respiratory function and stabilizing the massive hemorrhaging. He was kept alive through raw medical force, hooked to ventilators and blood transfusions. When the news reached the executives in Nashville, the reaction was swift and clinical. The industry monitored the hospital reports not out of profound empathy, but to calculate the depreciation of their asset. A dead Hank Jr. would guarantee a massive temporary spike in back catalog record sales. A severely brain-damaged, disfigured Hank Jr. was a permanent liability. They silently prepared to write him off the ledger. But the patient survived the critical 48-hour window. As soon as his vital signs stabilized enough to withstand transport, he was moved to specialized medical facilities to begin a brutal, unprecedented process of physical reconstruction. The survival was a medical anomaly, but the recovery was a protracted nightmare. Over the next 2 years, he was subjected to 17 distinct, highly invasive, reconstructive surgeries. The doctors had to literally rebuild his head. Because his facial bones were shattered beyond repair, surgeons had to repeatedly harvest thick sections of bone from his hips. They chiseled this bone down and grafted it into his skull, manually constructing new eye sockets, a new jawline, and a new structural foundation for his face. The physical agony of this process was absolute. The pain of the shattered skull was compounded by the deep, agonizing ache of the hip grafts. His jaw was wired completely shut for months at a time, forcing him to consume a strictly liquid diet through a straw while his body attempted to fuse the harvested bone. The surgery severely damaged his auditory nerves, leaving him with permanent, significant hearing loss, a devastating blow for a professional musician. The trauma also destroyed his tear ducts and left his eyes highly sensitive to light, requiring the permanent use of dark sunglasses. To manage this level of continuous searing pain, the medical establishment intervened with the only tool they had, heavy synthetic narcotics. The doctors prescribed massive doses of medical-grade opioid painkillers, including Demerol, Dilaudid, and morphine. This medical necessity rapidly engineered a new terrifying reality. Hank Jr. had previously been a recreational abuser of alcohol and street drugs, using them to numb the psychological pain of the Nashville machine. Now he was thrust into a state of severe, iatrogenic chemical dependency. His nervous system, completely rewired by the trauma of the fall and the subsequent surgeries, became utterly reliant on the pills. The recovery period was defined by a dark, volatile cycle of surgical intervention, extreme physical agony, and narcotic sedation. The painkillers dictated his waking hours. When the medication wore off, the pain from the metal plates in his head and the missing bone in his hips was paralyzing. He began to mix the high-dose opioids with whiskey, creating a lethal internal chemistry that made his behavior highly erratic and explosive. The Nashville establishment looked at the aftermath and saw a ruined product. The boy in the rhinestone suit was dead, left behind on the rocks of Ajax Peak. In his place was a severely scarred, heavily medicated, and deeply hostile man, whose face was held together by surgical steel and whose mind was clouded by prescription narcotics. To hide the extensive scarring, the sunken, rebuilt eye sockets, and the uneven bone grafts, he grew a dense, untamed beard. He pulled a wide-brimmed cowboy hat low over his surgically reconstructed forehead. He rarely took off the dark, wrap-around sunglasses. This was not a calculated marketing decision or a wardrobe choice. It was a physical necessity to hide a disfigurement. The industry assumed his career was effectively terminated. They severely underestimated the psychological mutation that the mountain had triggered. Stripped of his original face, completely written off by the corporate machine, and armed with a legitimate hard-earned fury, he was finally free to become exactly what they feared. The physical destruction of his face permanently severed the most lucrative asset the Nashville establishment possessed: his likeness. When he finally returned to the recording studio in the late 1970s, the acoustic chamber of his head had been fundamentally altered by surgical steel and grafted bone. His jaw, having been wired shut for extended periods and reconstructed from his own pelvis, no longer possessed the elasticity required for the smooth, high, lonesome yodeling of his father. His vocal cords, severely damaged by years of chain-smoking, heavy liquor, and the sheer physical trauma of intubation, had dropped an octave. The voice that emerged from the vocal booth was unrecognizable. It was a thick, abrasive growl saturated with gravel and the distinct slurring of a man heavily medicated on prescription opioids. He could no longer sing the Nashville sound. He could only sing his own. He recognized that his disfigurement was his emancipation. Because he was physically incapable of impersonating Hank Williams Sr., he was no longer legally or morally bound to try. He fired the old guard. He actively pushed away the legacy producers and session musicians who had policed his teenage recordings. Instead, he aligned himself with a different breed of musicians, operating entirely outside the sanitized corporate structure of Music Row. He brought in players heavily entrenched in the Southern rock and outlaw country movements. Men like Toy Caldwell of the Marshall Tucker Band, Charlie Daniels, and Waylon Jennings. These were musicians who played through heavily amplified Marshall stacks, who utilized distorted Fender Stratocasters, and who viewed country music not as a polished pop product, but as a gritty, aggressive reflection of working-class reality. The recording sessions that followed produced a sound that was deliberately hostile to the existing country music infrastructure. He stripped away the sweeping orchestral strings and the clean background vocal choirs mandated by the label. In their place, he installed driving heavy bass lines, screaming slide guitars, and an unrelenting drum backbeat that owed more to blues rock than to traditional honky-tonk. But the most violent shift was in the songwriting. He stopped recording sanitized covers of 1950s heartbreak. He began writing explicitly autobiographical tracks that served as direct journalistic accounts of his own dysfunction. He wrote about his extreme substance abuse, his violent run-ins with the law, his hatred for the Nashville elites, and the suffocating pressure of his family name. When the label executives heard the master tapes for albums like Family Tradition in 1979, the reaction was outright rejection. The country music establishment in the late 1970s was dominated by smooth crossover artists like John Denver and Kenny Rogers. Radio programmers operated under strict guidelines to keep the airwaves family-friendly and advertiser-safe. Hank Jr.'s new material was an undeniable liability. The songs openly endorsed heavy drug use, aggressive alcoholism, and anti-authoritarian violence. He was singing about smoking marijuana, getting blackout drunk, and actively threatening people who challenged his lifestyle. Industry gatekeepers deemed the music unmarketable and dangerous. Many major country radio stations flatly refused to put the records in their rotation. Some industry insiders claim executives actively tried to bury these initial post-crash records, deliberately withholding marketing budgets to starve the albums out of existence, while others assert the labels simply did not know how to monetize a scarred, volatile outlaw who routinely insulted them. Faced with a total radio embargo, Hank Jr. bypassed the corporate gatekeepers entirely. He took the music directly to the asphalt. If the radio stations would not broadcast his sound, he would force it into the culture through relentless, aggressive touring. He abandoned the polite theaters and state fairgrounds of his youth. He booked his band into massive, unseated arenas, notorious biker bars, and sprawling outdoor festivals across the Deep South and the Rust Belt. He specifically targeted a demographic that the polished Nashville establishment actively ignored: the disenfranchised, blue-collar, working-class males. These were Vietnam veterans, factory workers, and truck drivers who felt entirely disconnected from the smooth, wealthy pop country being broadcast on the radio. The live shows mutated into something resembling hard rock concerts rather than traditional country performances. The volume was deafening. The crowds were notoriously rowdy, heavily intoxicated, and volatile. Hank Jr., operating under the heavy influence of his own prescribed painkillers and whiskey, stalked the stage like a predator. Hidden behind his dark glasses and heavy beard, he projected an aura of genuine, unpredictable danger. He was not acting. The audience recognized the authenticity of a man who had literally been broken to pieces and refused to apologize for the jagged edges that remained. When he played the opening chords of Family Tradition or Whiskey Bent and Hellbound, it was not a musical performance, it was an act of communal defiance. This grassroots aggressive touring model bypassed the traditional industry metrics. The radio programmers were forced to capitulate. The demand from the working-class consumer base became too massive to ignore. Fans were flooding station switchboards, demanding to hear the abrasive, unapologetic tracks they had heard in the arenas. The records began to sell in staggering quantities without the aid of traditional corporate marketing. Between 1979 and 1992, he established a commercial dominance that completely humiliated the executives who had tried to discard him. He released a staggering string of 21 albums that achieved gold or platinum certification. He was named the Country Music Association's Entertainer of the Year. He achieved total commercial supremacy not by conforming to the system, but by successfully weaponizing his trauma against it. However, this unprecedented success was built on a deeply unstable physiological foundation. The outlaw persona was highly lucrative, but it required continuous maintenance. He had effectively monetized his rebellion, but he had also monetized his chemical dependency. The punishing touring schedule, combined with the lingering severe chronic pain from his skeletal reconstruction, meant his consumption of synthetic opioids and high-proof alcohol accelerated. The very substances he sang about to the cheers of millions were actively degrading his internal organs. He was operating an empire while trapped in a cycle of severe chemical reliance. The Nashville machine, recognizing the massive revenue he was now generating, dropped all moral objections. The executives who had previously threatened to end his career over his heavy sound now eagerly processed his royalty checks. They institutionalized his rebellion. They sold millions of units based on the image of the unstoppable scarred survivor, entirely ignoring the medical reality that their biggest star was self-destructing in plain sight. The industry had simply replaced the old cage with a new, highly profitable one, and this time the bars were made of prescription bottles and platinum records. By the mid-1980s, the raw grassroots touring that Hank Jr. initiated had metastasized into a massive corporate juggernaut. He was no longer a rogue element playing Rust Belt arenas. He was a highly efficient cash-generating monopoly sweeping the Country Music Association awards. The outlaw was now the primary financial engine of the industry. This absolute commercial dominance soon attracted a different tier of corporate syndicates, pulling the attention of television executives at the ABC network and the National Football League. The Monday Night Football broadcast needed a cultural mechanism to tether the rural working-class Southern male demographic to their advertising block. They identified Hank Williams Jr. not as a musician, but as the perfect demographic bait. In 1989, ABC executed a highly calculated corporate acquisition. They licensed his 1984 hit track, "All My Rowdy Friends Are Coming Over Tonight." The original context of the song dealt explicitly with heavy drinking, illicit drug use, and violent, destructive partying. ABC systematically stripped the song of its dangerous reality and sanitized it into an aggressive, stadium-friendly anthem. Hank Jr. was contracted to film a heavily produced introduction. Operating behind his signature dark sunglasses, he looked directly into the camera lens and screamed, "Are you ready for some football?" The transaction was monumental. It transformed the man who had nearly died trying to escape being an industry puppet in the 1960s into the highest-paid corporate mascot on American television. Every Monday night for over 2 decades, his reconstructed face and altered voice were beamed into millions of homes. He had fought a brutal, physically catastrophic war against the Nashville executives for his independence, only to willingly sign a contract that rendered him a cartoonish, highly lucrative caricature for a multinational sports monopoly. The rebellion had a price, and ABC paid it in full. In that same year, he executed an unprecedented clinical business maneuver that demonstrated absolute ruthless control over his family's legacy. For the first 30 years of his life, the ghost of Hank Williams Sr. was a curse. It was the mechanism the industry used to enslave him, dictate his clothing, and suppress his identity. But in 1989, Hank Jr. realized he possessed the leverage and the capital to weaponize the ghost for his own profit. He authorized his production team to utilize early cutting-edge electronic audio splicing. They located a rare discarded acetate recording of his father performing an obscure track called "There's a Tear in My Beer." Using studio synthesizers and digital manipulation, they isolated the dead man's vocals and grafted Hank Jr.'s heavily amplified, gravelly voice directly onto the track. He did not stop at audio manipulation. He utilized rudimentary green screen video technology to physically insert himself into archival footage of his father. The resulting music video was a masterpiece of psychological irony and commercial engineering. On screen, the heavily scarred, bearded outlaw appeared to stand shoulder to shoulder, trading verses with the thin, 29-year-old father he never truly knew. The public consumed it as a touching, long overdue reunion between father and son. The industry rewarded the project with a Grammy Award. But beneath the surface, it was a demonstration of cold pragmatism. He dug up the exact ghost he had spent his youth running from, plugged it into a soundboard, and sold millions of units. He proved definitively that he could monetize the Hank Williams trademark far more efficiently and ruthlessly than the executives who had originally stolen his childhood. However, managing this sprawling, highly profitable empire required an unsustainable biological baseline. The public was sold the image of an indestructible, rowdy survivor. The forensic reality behind the gated perimeter of his massive Tennessee and Montana compounds was severe, continuous physical deterioration. The human skeletal structure is not engineered to sustain a relentless, high-impact touring schedule into its 40s and 50s, particularly when that structure is held together by surgical steel and deteriorating bone grafts. The massive pelvic bone sections harvested in the 1970s to rebuild his face began to suffer from accelerated osteoarthritis. The metal plates anchoring his jawline generated chronic, radiating neuralgia. His hearing, already severely compromised by the initial cranial trauma and subsequent surgeries, rapidly declined due to decades of exposure to stadium-level amplification. He was a professional musician who increasingly relied on heavily equalized inner ear monitors just to process pitch and rhythm. To sustain the grueling pace of his touring and television obligations, his daily consumption of high-grade narcotics and alcohol compounded. This toxic internal chemistry severely degraded his personal life, transforming him into a highly volatile, deeply paranoid figure who aggressively isolated himself behind a wall of private security. By the late 1990s, the outlaw had successfully conquered the industry, but he was entirely trapped within his own fortress. He dictated the rules, he owned the publishing rights, and he controlled the narrative. Yet he was a heavily medicated, physically failing man who required a massive chemical intake simply to stand in front of a camera and scream about football. The external war against the Nashville machine was over. The internal war of attrition against his own body had just begun. As the calendar turned into the 2000s, the operational landscape of the Nashville music industry underwent a massive, calculated recalibration. The raw, heavy outlaw sound that Hank Williams Jr. had weaponized to dominate the 1980s charts, was systematically phased out by corporate radio programmers. A new, highly polished, pop-centric format, eventually categorized as bro country, took total control of the airwaves. The industry pivoted away from aging, scarred rebels and began aggressively marketing a sanitized, youth-oriented product. Hank Jr.'s record sales inevitably plummeted. His singles vanished from the Billboard top tiers. The massive commercial engine he had built was stalling, not because he had lost his edge, but because the corporate algorithm had simply moved on to a more compliant demographic. Faced with the permanent evaporation of his radio relevance, Hank Jr. executed a highly strategic defensive pivot. He recognized that while mainstream country radio had abandoned him, his core audience, a massive block of disenfranchised blue-collar rural males, remained entirely intact. But to maintain their loyalty and their capital without the aid of radio airplay, he needed a new mechanism of engagement. He found it in political grievance. He actively transitioned his brand from a musical outlaw to a hardline, anti-establishment political lightning rod. He understood a fundamental reality of the American entertainment market. Manufactured political anger is highly lucrative. He began utilizing his live arena shows not merely as concerts, but as aggressive partisan rallies. He swapped the electric guitar solos for extended, unvarnished diatribes against the federal government, cultural shifts, and the mainstream media. He actively courted a demographic that felt deeply alienated by the changing American landscape in the post-9/11 and early Obama eras. He successfully transferred the anti-authority rebellion of his early drug-fueled records into the realm of modern political warfare. His audience did not shrink. It simply hardened into a fiercely loyal, ideological voting bloc that purchased concert tickets and merchandise as a form of political protest. This strategy of extreme monetized polarization operated perfectly within the controlled environment of his live shows. However, when he attempted to export this unvarnished hostility into the highly regulated arena of mainstream network news, the result was a corporate catastrophe. The collision occurred on the morning of October 3rd, 2011. Hank Jr. was booked for a live satellite interview on the conservative morning program Fox and Friends. The booking was not intended to elicit serious political analysis. The network producers viewed him as a useful, recognizable mascot, a celebrity conservative brought on to provide predictable, folksy sound bites criticizing the current administration. But they severely underestimated the volatility of the man they had put on live television. Operating from a remote feed, heavily concealed behind his signature wraparound sunglasses and a thick beard, his physical demeanor was immediately hostile. His speech patterns were thick, disjointed, and noticeably slurred, suggesting he was either heavily medicated or operating under the influence of his standard chemical baseline. The anchors initiated a standard talking point, asking for his assessment of a recent, highly publicized golf outing involving Democratic President Barack Obama and Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner. The question was designed to generate a mild partisan complaint about political fraternization. Instead, Hank Jr. bypassed all broadcast standards and delivered a highly radioactive, unscripted assessment. He explicitly and forcefully stated that the golf game was the equivalent of Hitler playing golf with Netanyahu. The reaction in the studio was a scene of immediate visible panic. The anchors recognized instantly that the use of a Nazi analogy directed at a sitting U.S. president on live television was a severe violation of network protocol. They attempted to interject, desperately offering him an off-ramp to clarify, soften, or walk back the statement. He flatly refused the lifeline. He doubled down with absolute aggression, identifying the President and Vice President of the United States not as political opponents, but explicitly as the enemy. The broadcast ended, but the corporate guillotine dropped with unprecedented speed. The blast radius of the comments extended far beyond the Fox News demographic. ESPN, the massive sports conglomerate owned by the Walt Disney Company, was entirely reliant on broad public appeal and massive risk-averse advertiser revenue. They had utilized Hank Jr.'s All My Rowdy Friends as the opening theme for Monday Night Football for 22 consecutive years. He was the literal face of their primetime franchise. Now, he was an immediate, toxic liability. ESPN executives did not wait for public consensus. Within hours of the broadcast, they permanently severed the relationship. They pulled his theme song from the broadcast that very night, erasing 2 decades of branding in a matter of minutes. The mainstream media consensus was unanimous. Hank Williams Jr. had finally destroyed his own empire through sheer unhinged arrogance. Standard industry protocol following a high-profile termination dictates a highly choreographed sequence, a drafted public apology, a statement of reflection, and a strategic period of silence managed by crisis public relations firms. Hank Jr. rejected the entire playbook. He did not issue a retraction. He did not apologize for the Hitler analogy. Instead, he executed a direct, calculated counterstrike against the television networks that had just fired him. Within 48 hours of his termination, he wrote, recorded, and aggressively released a new track titled Keep the Change. The song was a forensic dismantling of his critics. The lyrics openly mocked Fox News for their panic, attacked ESPN for their corporate cowardice, and leaned heavily into his status as a permanent, unrepentant outsider. He did not route the song through traditional label distribution. He offered it as a free download directly on his personal website. The response validated his entire business model. The influx of traffic from his mobilized, angry fan base was so massive that it physically crashed his internet servers within hours. He immediately pivoted to physical distribution, pressing thousands of CDs and selling them directly to his audience. He moved hundreds of thousands of units of Keep the Change without a single second of radio airplay or corporate promotion. The 2011 incident was a definitive stress test of his autonomy. The media establishment assumed that by removing his massive ESPN platform, they would effectively bankrupt his cultural relevance and force his submission. They failed to realize that he had spent the last 30 years explicitly building an infrastructure designed to survive without their approval. He weaponized his own cancellation. He proved that his specific demographic was completely detached from mainstream media outrage, and that he could generate massive revenue simply by standing his ground and aggressively insulting the system that tried to fire him. He lost a television contract, but he successfully monetized the fallout, cementing his status as a man who would gladly burn down his own corporate deals if it meant nobody else got to hold the leash. The corporate exile following the 2011 television broadcast did not destroy Hank Williams Jr. financially, but it permanently solidified his operational isolation. He retreated entirely behind the fortified perimeters of his massive real estate holdings in Tennessee and Montana, severing all remaining superficial ties with the mainstream entertainment industry. The media conglomerates assumed his exile was a punishment. In reality, it was a highly funded, self-imposed quarantine. He had successfully consolidated his base, ensuring his revenue streams were completely detached from corporate sponsors, network television executives, or radio programmers. He operated as a completely autonomous, highly lucrative island. But biological reality does not respect financial autonomy. While he had successfully insulated himself from the Nashville executives, he could not isolate himself from the compounding physiological debt of his own history. By his late 60s and early 70s, the medical bill for the 1975 Ajax Peak catastrophe came due in full. The human body is not engineered to function for half a century on a reconstructed skeletal framework. The massive bone grafts harvested from his pelvis in the late 1970s and fused to his shattered skull began to suffer from severe, accelerated osteoarthritis. The titanium plates and surgical screws anchoring his cheekbones and jawline became a source of chronic, radiating neuralgia as the surrounding tissue aged and thinned. The auditory nerve damage, initially a direct byproduct of the cranial trauma and subsequent invasive surgeries, deteriorated into profound, irreversible hearing loss. He was a professional touring musician who could barely process acoustic frequencies without the aid of heavily amplified, specialized inner ear monitors. To manage the escalating, agonizing pain of a rapidly deteriorating physical infrastructure, his reliance on heavy prescription narcotics and alcohol remained a permanent, non-negotiable fixture of his existence. He was trapped in a relentless, unforgiving cycle of physical maintenance. Every public appearance, every aggressive live performance required a carefully calibrated intake of chemical painkillers just to allow his central nervous system to withstand the stage lights and project the outlaw persona. The music industry had spent decades marketing his scars as a symbol of indestructible macho rebellion. The forensic reality was that he was a severely disabled man managing a daily excruciating physical collapse. In August 2020, the ultimate corporate irony materialized. The Country Music Association, representing the exact establishment that had nearly driven him to suicide in 1974, that had categorically rejected his aggressive sound in 1979, and that had quietly distanced itself from his political extremism in 2011, officially announced his induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a purely calculated, institutional transaction. The syndicate executives recognized that they could no longer exclude one of the highest-grossing and most influential artists in the history of the genre without severely delegitimizing their own museum. They needed his legacy to validate their institution. He accepted the induction, but there was no grand reconciliation. He did not issue a tearful speech thanking the industry that had enslaved him as a child. He understood the mechanical nature of the gesture. They were simply cataloging him, attempting to finally place the uncontrollable outlaw behind a glass display case where they could dictate the narrative. However, the Hall of Fame induction was immediately eclipsed by a sequence of catastrophic personal tragedies that fundamentally destroyed the trajectory of his remaining years. He had spent his entire life successfully cheating death, surviving a massive intentional chemical overdose, a 500-foot free fall down a mountain, and decades of severe, unregulated substance abuse. He was the ultimate survivor, but death did not require his direct participation to dismantle his life. It simply bypassed his fortified perimeter and targeted the people he loved. On the evening of June 13, 2020, his 27-year-old daughter, Catherine Williams Dunning, was driving a 2007 Chevrolet Tahoe southbound on U.S. Highway 79 in Henry County, Tennessee. She was towing a boat, accompanied by her husband. According to the official collision report filed by the Tennessee Highway Patrol, the vehicle inexplicably drifted across the dividing median. In a violent, immediate loss of kinetic control, the heavy SUV initiated a multi-axle rollover sequence, violently crossing the northbound lanes. Catherine was ejected from the rolling vehicle before it impacted the highway shoulder. The blunt force trauma she sustained during the rapid deceleration and impact was catastrophic. She was pronounced dead directly at the crash site. For Hank Williams Jr., the psychological impact was absolute and devastating. The man who had survived a pulverized skull and exposed brain tissue on a remote mountain in 1975 was forced to confront the sudden, irreversible obliteration of his youngest daughter on a stretch of flat Tennessee asphalt. There were no highly skilled surgical teams to rebuild her, no miraculous recoveries, and no second chances. The tough, cynical outlaw armor he had spent 40 years building to protect himself from the music industry offered zero defense against the random, senseless brutality of a highway fatality. The loss plunged him into a profound, dark isolation, pulling him almost entirely out of the public eye. The grieving period was short-lived, violently interrupted by a second medically induced catastrophe. Less than 2 years later, on March 22, 2022, his wife of over 30 years, Mary Jane Thomas, traveled to Jupiter, Florida. She checked into a specialized medical facility for an elective cosmetic surgery procedure involving liposuction and the removal of breast implants. She was 58 years old and officially cleared for the operation, but the procedure went fatally wrong. The official autopsy report released by the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner detailed a lethal mechanical surgical error. During the liposuction procedure, the operating physician's instrument accidentally punctured the parietal pleura, the vital membrane surrounding the lung. This mechanical breach caused a massive pneumothorax, effectively collapsing the lung and trapping pressurized air in the chest cavity, which rapidly compressed her heart and surrounding vital organs. She suffered immediate cardiopulmonary arrest in the recovery room. Despite emergency resuscitation efforts and rapid transport to a local hospital, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The forensic reality of his wife's death carried a devastating, cruel irony. Hank Williams Jr. owed his entire continued existence to the miraculous precision of reconstructive surgeons who had meticulously rebuilt his shattered body over 17 separate operations. Medical science had literally pieced him back together from nothing. Decades later, that exact same medical infrastructure killed his wife during a routine elective procedure due to a lethal slip of a surgical instrument. The consecutive loss of his daughter and his wife effectively ended the active era of Hank Williams Jr. The aggressive, defiant rebel who had spent a lifetime loudly fighting the system was reduced to heavy silence. He liquidated massive portions of his real estate portfolio, selling off the sprawling Tennessee properties that had served as his fortress for decades. He consolidated his existence, retreating almost entirely to the harsh, isolated terrain of his Montana ranch, the exact same geography he had fled to in 1975 when he first tried to escape the Nashville machine. Today, he exists as a historical anomaly. He is one of the last living architects of the 20th century outlaw country movement. He possesses immense wealth, complete ownership of his intellectual property, and total undeniable independence from the corporate syndicates that tried to control his youth. He won the war against the Nashville establishment through sheer, stubborn, highly medicated attrition. But a forensic audit of his life reveals the catastrophic price of that victory. He successfully avoided the fate of his father, the man who drank himself to death in the back seat of a powder blue Cadillac at age 29. He survived the machine, but he paid for his independence with a shattered skeleton, a lifetime of chemical dependency, and the agonizing trauma of outliving the people he was supposed to protect. He is not a heroic, misunderstood poet, nor is he a victim. He is a man who recognized early that the music industry is a meat grinder and chose to jump into a different set of gears to maintain his autonomy. Hank Williams Jr. beat the system on his own uncompromising terms, but the ultimate reality of his rebellion is documented by medical records, autopsy reports, and gravestones. He claimed the throne of the outlaw, and he is now serving out his final years as the sole, isolated ruler of a deeply scarred empire.